She was billed as the next great American actress, magnetic on stage, luminous on screen, then vanished into a scandal that Hollywood has tried to turn into legend. This is the story of Frances Farmer, the rebellious star who refused to play by the studio rules and paid a devastating price. In the late 1930s, she shared the marquee with Bing Crosby and Walter Brennan, turning heads in films like Rhythm on the Range and Come and Get It. Audiences saw a rising comet. Insiders saw a young woman who wouldn't bend. Then came the arrests, the headlines, and the courtroom outbursts. By 1944, Farmer, declared legally insane, was committed to Western State Hospital in Washington, where she would spend years away from the cameras, and where the line between truth and rumor began to blur. History link. For decades, the most shocking claim was that she'd been lobotomized. But when researchers and former hospital staff finally compared the myths with the records, something unexpected emerged. No credible evidence of any lobotomy at all. The nurses on the lobotomy ward didn't remember her. The hospital logs didn't list her. The researcher who accessed medical and court files found the sensational tale fictionalized. So why did the legend stick? And what really happened inside those locked rooms? If the image was a lie, what truth was powerful enough to replace it? Frances Elena Farmer was born on September 19, 1913, in Seattle, Washington, to a family already marked by turbulence. Her father, Ernest Farmer, was a lawyer with a sharp mind but little stability. Her mother, Lillian, was strong-willed, controlling, and would play a defining role, often a destructive one, in Frances's life. From childhood, Frances grew up in a household where conflict simmered beneath the surface. As a girl, Frances was bright, curious, and outspoken. She devoured books, questioned authority, and was unafraid to speak her mind, traits that clashed with her mother's iron-handed expectations of obedience. Lillian demanded propriety and respectability, while Frances rebelled against conformity. This push and pull between a controlling mother and an independent daughter would echo through her entire life. In high school, Frances already displayed a flair for drama, both on stage and off. She wrote essays that questioned religion, politics, and social norms. One of her early controversies came in 1931 when, at just 17 years old, she wrote an essay for a school contest titled God Dies, which shocked conservative Seattle. While some saw a rebellious streak, others recognized the depth of her intellect and her refusal to parrot conventional thinking. At the University of Washington, Frances pursued drama and journalism. She won a writing prize that included a trip to the Soviet Union, an extraordinary feat for a young American woman in the 1930s. Newspapers sensationalized it, branding her a girl communist, simply because she had traveled to Moscow at a time when suspicion of socialism was rampant. Frances herself denied being politically aligned, but the scandal foreshadowed her later clashes with authority. Hollywood, like her hometown, had little tolerance for women who refused to conform. Her experiences in Seattle and Moscow shaped her worldview. Frances began to see the hypocrisy in American culture, where freedom was celebrated but dissent punished. She carried this rebellious spirit with her as she pursued an acting career. On stage, she was electric, her presence raw, intense, and undeniable. Critics praised her as a new kind of actress, unpolished yet deeply authentic. But beneath her talent, Frances carried the scars of her upbringing. The battles with her mother left her vulnerable, defensive, and deeply mistrustful of authority figures. These traits, which gave her performances a searing honesty, would also set her on a collision course with Hollywood's rigid studio system, a system built on obedience, control, and image-making. By the time Frances left Seattle for Hollywood, she was not just a star in the making. She was a young woman determined to remain herself in a world that demanded complete submission. The stage was set for both her meteoric rise and her catastrophic fall. When Frances Farmer arrived in Hollywood in the mid-1930s, she was not the typical ingenue the studios were used to. She wasn't eager to play the obedient starlet or be remolded into a marketable persona. She came armed with intellectual firepower, a sharp tongue, and a fierce desire to be taken seriously as an artist. Hollywood, however, thrived on glamour, image, and control, qualities Frances openly resisted. Her first major break came when Paramount Pictures signed her in 1936. She was cast in Too Many Parents, 1936, followed by Rhythm on the Range, 1936, where she starred opposite Bing Crosby. Audiences were struck by her striking beauty and natural screen presence, different from the polished, doll-like stars of her era. Critics described her as refreshing and uncontrived. To Hollywood insiders, though, Frances was difficult to manage. She resisted studio publicity stunts, openly dismissed fluff roles, and openly mocked the trivial questions asked by reporters. In 1937, she starred in Come and Get It, directed by William Wyler and later Howard Hawks. The film cemented her reputation as a serious actress, playing the role of Lotta, a saloon singer who evolves into a tragic figure. Frances brought raw intensity to the screen. The performance was so compelling that critics began to call her the next great star. Paramount envisioned her as a new kind of leading lady, independent, bold, and modern. But Frances didn't see Hollywood as the pinnacle of her ambitions. She viewed film as shallow compared to the stage, where she had first found her artistic identity. While her peers basked in fame, Frances grew restless. She longed to return to theater, particularly to work with experimental groups such as the Group Theater in New York. Her disdain for Hollywood conventions quickly became evident. She refused to play the publicity game, dodging interviews, mocking gossip columnists, and even skipping studio events. When other starlets were carefully coiffed and presented, Frances appeared in simple dresses, hair unstyled, uninterested in impressing the press. She challenged the studio executives' authority and demanded roles that carried weight and meaning. Hollywood did not reward rebellion. The industry was a machine designed to manufacture stars, and Frances's refusal to conform threatened that system. Her contract roles became fewer and less significant. Some executives labeled her difficult, while others quietly pushed her aside, preferring stars who followed the rules. Still, Frances found her footing on the stage. In 1937, she moved to New York to work with the Group Theater, where she acted in plays that matched her ideals, gritty, socially conscious productions. She starred in Clifford Odets' Golden Boy and other works that addressed class struggle, politics, and morality. Unlike Hollywood fluff, these roles gave Frances a platform to channel her defiance and passion. But Hollywood wasn't done with her. Studios continued to pull her back into films, often in projects she found trivial. By the early 1940s, her career was trapped in a tug-of-war between her pursuit of serious artistry and the studio's desire to cast her as a glamorous screen presence. It was during this period that Frances's private frustrations began spilling into her public image. She clashed openly with directors, argued with producers, and became notorious for speaking her mind. To her fans, she seemed fearless. To Hollywood, she was becoming a liability. The tension reached a boiling point when her personal struggles, drinking, failed relationships, and her increasing sense of isolation began making headlines. The press painted her as erratic, combative, and unstable, and in a town where image was everything, Frances Farmer's refusal to be controlled was a dangerous act of rebellion. Her early career had proven her talent and promise, but her defiance had also placed her on a collision course with the Hollywood system, a battle that would soon spill into the public, leading to her infamous arrests and commitment to a mental hospital. By the late 1930s, Frances Farmer stood on the threshold of greatness. Critics hailed her as one of the brightest new stars in Hollywood, a rare talent who combined natural beauty with an emotional intensity uncommon for her time. Come and Get It, 1936, and her stage work in New York's Group Theater had positioned her as both a film star and a serious actress. Audiences loved her freshness, unpolished, modern, and defiantly authentic. Unlike many of her contemporaries, Frances did not appear manufactured, she appeared real. But this authenticity, the very quality that made her magnetic, was also what set her apart from the carefully controlled world of Hollywood. She despised the shallowness of the studio publicity machine, where every smile, every date, and every gown was orchestrated for maximum effect. Where other actresses leaned into the glamour, Frances openly rejected it. She refused to play along with fabricated romances planted in gossip columns. She scoffed at puff-piece interviews that asked about diets and beauty routines. She wanted to be recognized for her artistry, not her appearance. This attitude both intrigued and enraged the press. Reporters branded her aloof, arrogant, even ungrateful. Studios began to see her as incooperative, a dangerous label in an industry where compliance was everything. Still, her undeniable talent kept her in the spotlight, and she continued to earn roles in films like Ebb Tide, 1937, Exclusive, 1937, and South of Pago Pago, 1940. Even as her star rose, cracks began to form. Frances was outspoken about her disdain for Hollywood's studio system, a stance that was practically suicidal for an actress in the 1930s. While others curried favor with powerful producers, Frances openly challenged them. She demanded better scripts, resisted being typecast, and ridiculed the idea of being a movie star. Instead, she aligned herself with New York's Group Theater, a collective of actors and writers committed to politically charged, socially relevant productions. In New York, she found both inspiration and trouble. She performed alongside rising talents like Elia Kazan and Clifford Odets, thriving in the raw, intense atmosphere of the stage. But her connection to the group theater also drew suspicion. In the late 1930s, leftist politics and artistic rebellion were already attracting scrutiny, and Frances's association with progressive circles only deepened the press's portrayal of her as reckless and rebellious. Meanwhile, her personal life reflected the same turbulence as her career. Frances married actor Leif Erikson in 1936, but the marriage quickly soured. Plagued by drinking, arguments, and mutual infidelity, their relationship dissolved in 1942, leaving Frances more isolated than ever. Her drinking, which had started as a way to cope with the pressures of Hollywood, began to spiral out of control. By the early 1940s, she was often intoxicated at parties and confrontational in public. The press eagerly reported her outbursts, painting her as unstable. In reality, Frances was a woman under immense strain, caught between her ambitions as a serious artist and the suffocating demands of an industry that had no room for her defiance. Her rebellion reached a breaking point in 1942, when she was arrested in Santa Monica for driving under the influence. She resisted the police, reportedly shouting at officers and making a scene that became front-page news. It was the beginning of a downward spiral that would soon consume her career and her life. From that point on, Frances Farmer was no longer described as a rising star. She was portrayed as Hollywood's bad girl, a cautionary tale of wasted talent. The industry turned its back. The press feasted on her downfall, and Frances herself seemed determined to live up to the rebellious image thrust upon her. She had broken through to stardom, but at a cost. The same qualities that had once made her extraordinary, her honesty, independence, and refusal to conform, were now seen as liabilities. And as the pressures mounted, Frances Farmer's brilliance would be overshadowed by scandal, arrests, and eventually, the tragic label of madness. If Frances Farmer's career was defined by her rebellion against Hollywood, then her love life was shaped by the same turbulent, restless spirit. She was not the type to settle quietly into a studio-arranged romance, nor to pose as the demure wife of a powerful leading man. Instead, her relationships reflected her fire, passionate, stormy, and often destructive. Her first major romance in Hollywood was with actor Leif Erikson, whom she married in 1936. To outsiders, it seemed a glamorous union, two young stars on the rise, carving out careers in an industry obsessed with beautiful couples. But behind closed doors, the marriage was marked by volatility. Both Frances and Leif were known for heavy drinking, and arguments frequently turned explosive. Friends later recalled that their fights could be as dramatic as any Hollywood script. Infidelity only deepened the rift, and by 1942, The marriage collapsed in a bitter divorce. For Frances, it was another strike against the image of stability that Hollywood demanded from its stars. There were rumors of other relationships, too, fleeting affairs with fellow actors, directors, and playwrights. Her time with the group theater in New York connected her with men like playwright Clifford Odets, who was rumored to have admired her fiery independence. But Frances was never one to play the role of muse or compliant lover. She wanted equality, passion, and freedom, qualities not easily found in an industry built on control. Her defiance of Hollywood's expectations extended to her public image. While most actresses carefully crafted reputations of purity or romantic fantasy, Frances spoke candidly about sex, relationships, and her distaste for domesticity. She dismissed the idea of being a movie star wife, preferring instead to live on her own terms. In the conservative 1930s and 1940s, such statements were scandalous. The tabloids seized on her every misstep. Her drinking became a favorite topic, with stories of drunken escapades and public confrontations splashed across front pages. At parties, Frances was loud, confrontational, and unapologetic, qualities that made her fascinating but also dangerous in a culture that demanded women remain poised and quiet. Her arrest in 1942 for drunk driving was only the beginning. Over the next few years, Frances was repeatedly in trouble with the law, arrested for disorderly conduct, public drunkenness, and defying authority. One infamous incident in 1943 saw her dragged into court, where she reportedly cursed at the judge and had to be physically restrained. Photographs of her being manhandled by police circulated widely, cementing her reputation as Hollywood's bad girl. But the scandals were not just about alcohol. Rumors circulated of affairs with married men, late-night brawls, and violent outbursts. The press painted her as unhinged, a cautionary tale of what happened when a woman refused to behave. Some columnists even suggested she was possessed or mad, fueling the narrative that would soon justify her commitment to psychiatric institutions. And yet, beneath the lurid headlines, Frances Farmer was a woman crying out against a system that sought to silence her. Her drinking was, in many ways, a rebellion against the suffocating expectations of Hollywood. Her confrontations were acts of defiance against authority figures who tried to control her. She was unwilling to be packaged into the docile starlet mold, and so she was punished. Publicly and repeatedly. Her love life, her scandals, her arrests, they were all wielded as weapons to destroy her credibility, to brand her as unstable, and to prepare the world for the final act of her downfall. Frances Farmer was no longer the rising star with a brilliant future. She had become Hollywood's favorite scandal, and the industry was ready to wash its hands of her. But the story was far from over. What followed would be darker, more shocking, and infinitely more tragic than any tabloid headline could capture. By 1942, Frances Farmer's reputation had shifted from promising actress to Hollywood's most volatile star. What had begun as whispers of her rebelliousness now erupted into a series of very public scandals. For the press, she was no longer the next great actress, but rather a woman spiraling out of control. For Frances, it was the beginning of a nightmare that would define the rest of her life. The turning point came in October 1942, when Frances was arrested in Santa Monica for driving under the influence. Reports say she became combative, shouting at officers and refusing to comply. The arrest was splashed across newspapers. But instead of sympathy, Frances was mocked. She was called a fallen star, a disgrace, and a wild woman. For an actress in an era when studios controlled every detail of their stars' images, this kind of publicity was devastating. Her troubles didn't stop there. In January 1943, she was arrested again, this time for assaulting a hairdresser in Beverly Hills. The confrontation, which began as an argument, escalated until Frances allegedly struck the man. She was taken to court, where her defiance made headlines once more. Instead of showing remorse, Frances railed against the system, yelling at the judge, "You have no right to treat me this way." The courtroom exploded into chaos. Witnesses described her as wild, furious, and uncontrollable. The press, of course, devoured every detail. The image of Frances being dragged out of court, screaming, struggling against officers, became iconic. To her supporters, it was proof of her refusal to submit. To her critics, it confirmed the narrative that she was mad. And to the studio system, it was the last straw. No longer profitable, Frances was blacklisted from serious film roles. But the scandals only grew darker. Later in 1943, Frances was again in custody. This time after being found wandering disoriented through a hotel lobby. Intoxicated and incoherent, the judge, weary of her repeated arrests, declared her mentally unstable. Instead of jail, she was sent to psychiatric evaluation, a decision that would alter the course of her life forever. In 1944, Frances Farmer was committed to Western State Hospital in Steilacoom, Washington. She was just 31 years old. Officially, she was diagnosed with manic depressive psychosis. But the truth of what happened inside those hospital walls became a breeding ground for one of Hollywood's most shocking legends. Rumors began to spread that Frances had been subjected to horrific treatments. Some said she was given repeated rounds of insulin shock therapy and electroconvulsive therapy. Others whispered of physical abuse, forced labor, and even sexual assault by hospital staff. The most shocking claim, which surfaced in the decades after her death, was that Frances had been subjected to a lobotomy, a brutal brain surgery meant to cure mental illness by severing parts of the frontal lobe. Whether or not the lobotomy ever happened remains hotly debated. Medical records from the hospital do not list the procedure, and later investigations found no concrete evidence it occurred. Yet the rumor stuck, in part because it seemed to fit the tragic narrative of Frances's life, a brilliant woman, silenced and destroyed by a world that feared her independence. Inside the hospital, Frances's life was a mix of silence and suffering. Accounts suggest she endured harsh treatments, was medicated heavily, and spent years in institutional limbo. Her mother, Lillian, took legal guardianship, further straining their already toxic relationship. For Frances, it was as though her defiance had finally been crushed, not by Hollywood scandal, but by the weight of society's determination to break her spirit. By the mid-1940s, Frances Farmer was gone from Hollywood. The actress once hailed as the future of American cinema had been reduced to a cautionary tale. A starlet who dared to defy the system and was destroyed for it. Her scandals were no longer tabloid fodder, they were the justification for her erasure. Hollywood moved on, building up new stars, while Frances was locked away, her voice silenced. Yet the question lingered, was Frances Farmer truly insane? Or was her madness the label forced upon a woman who simply refused to obey? The tragedy of her downfall was not just personal, it was systemic. Frances Farmer's story revealed the ruthless machinery of Hollywood and the cruelty of a society unwilling to accept a woman who lived and spoke on her own terms. After years in and out of psychiatric institutions, Frances Farmer's life slowly shifted into a quieter, more subdued existence. The once fiery actress who had challenged Hollywood and the courts with her defiance now returned to society deeply scarred by her ordeals. Her time at Western State Hospital had taken a heavy toll, both physically and emotionally. The young woman who had once radiated independence and intensity now carried the weight of trauma and years of lost opportunities. By the late 1940s, Frances was released intermittently into her mother's custody. This arrangement was fraught with tension. Lillian Farmer had always been a controlling presence in Frances's life. And now, with legal guardianship, her control was absolute. Frances resented this deeply, and their relationship became increasingly bitter. Accounts suggest heated arguments, verbal abuse, and constant power struggles between mother and daughter. Some biographers even argue that the oppressive presence of her mother only deepened Frances's instability. Still, Frances attempted to rebuild her life. In the early 1950s, she took small jobs outside of Hollywood, working as a secretary, a hotel desk clerk, and even briefly managing a movie theater. These jobs, though far removed from the glamour of the screen, offered her something she hadn't had in years: a measure of stability. But for the public, Frances Farmer remained a figure shrouded in scandal and rumor. The 1950s also saw a cruel evolution of the lobotomy myth. Though hospital records and medical testimony gave no evidence that Frances had undergone the procedure, tabloids and gossip columns repeated the story endlessly. It was the ultimate symbol of her downfall. Hollywood's rebellious star allegedly reduced to silence by surgery. While historians later debunked the claim, it persisted in the public imagination, cementing Frances's image as a victim of both medicine and the studio system. Despite her tarnished reputation, Frances made attempts to return to performing. In the mid-1950s, she appeared on stage in regional theater productions. Though her spark was dimmed, traces of her immense talent still shone through. Audiences noted flashes of brilliance, but the years of institutionalization and public humiliation had left their mark. She no longer had the drive, or the support system, needed to rebuild a career in Hollywood. A surprising second act came in the 1960s. When Frances found modest success on television, she appeared on talk shows and hosted a local Indianapolis program called Frances Farmer Presents, where she introduced classic films to viewers. For a brief moment, it seemed she might reclaim a fragment of her former stardom. Viewers were fascinated by her calm, composed demeanor, a stark contrast to the wild tabloid caricature that had haunted her for decades. But the past was never far behind. Interviewers often pressed her about the scandals, the arrests, and the lobotomy rumors. Frances, visibly weary, alternated between candid remarks and evasive deflections. She seemed determined not to relive the traumas that had defined her. When asked directly about her time in institutions, she would often go quiet, her silence speaking louder than any answer could. Her health, however, continued to decline. Years of alcohol abuse had left their mark, and by the late 1960s she was struggling with cirrhosis of the liver. Despite attempts to stay active, her body was failing. In 1970, Frances was diagnosed with esophageal cancer. She faced the disease with the same stoic defiance that had marked her youth. But by 1970, the once bright star of Hollywood's golden age had been reduced to a shadow of herself. She passed away on August 1, 1970, at the age of 56. Frances Farmer's later years were quieter than her explosive rise and fall. But they carried a haunting weight. She never fully escaped the myths that had grown around her, the scandals, the madness, and the lobotomy that never was. Instead, she lived out her final decades as a tragic figure, caught between the truth of her resilience and the legend of her destruction. To this day, her legacy remains entangled in mystery. Was she truly the madwoman of Hollywood lore, or was she the victim of a merciless system that punished her for refusing to conform? The answer may lie somewhere in between, but what is undeniable is that Frances Farmer lived and died as one of Hollywood's most haunting cautionary tales. By the late 1960s, Frances Farmer was no longer the rebellious ingenue who had once electrified Hollywood. She was living in Indianapolis, far removed from the film industry that had both created and destroyed her. Her work as the host of Frances Farmer Presents gave her a steady income and a modest platform. For nearly 6 years, she introduced classic films to a loyal regional audience. Unlike the spotlight of Hollywood, this was a quieter fame, more forgiving, and less invasive. But even in this small corner of television, Frances remained a subject of fascination. Guests, producers, and journalists often wanted to hear about her scandalous past, the arrests, the institutions, the infamous lobotomy rumor. Frances, visibly weary, handled these questions with a mixture of patience and dismissal. At times, she hinted at the horrors she had endured in psychiatric hospitals. At others, she brushed aside the stories as exaggerations. It was clear she wanted to be seen as a survivor, not a victim. Privately, her health was failing. Decades of alcohol abuse had ravaged her body, leaving her with cirrhosis of the liver and weakening her immune system. In 1970, she was diagnosed with esophageal cancer. She reportedly faced the illness with the same stoic resilience that had defined her life. But by the summer of that year, her body could no longer endure. On August 1, 1970, Frances Farmer died in Indianapolis at the age of 56. Her death was met with both sadness and sensationalism. Newspapers that had once mocked her now mourned her as a tragic figure. A woman destroyed by Hollywood's unforgiving machine. Fans who had grown up watching her films and her TV program grieved quietly, while others revisited the rumors of her lobotomy, treating her story as one final Hollywood horror tale. In the years following her death, Frances Farmer's legend only grew. In 1972, journalist William Arnold published Shadowland, a controversial biography that claimed Frances had indeed undergone a lobotomy, though medical records do not support this. The book cemented the idea in public imagination. Hollywood later dramatized her life in the 1982 film Frances, starring Jessica Lange, which portrayed Farmer's institutionalization in brutal, graphic detail, including the lobotomy. Lange's performance earned her an Academy Award nomination, but the film further blurred the line between fact and myth. For many, Frances Farmer became less a person than a symbol, the doomed starlet destroyed by Hollywood, by her own demons, or by both. She was cast as a martyr of the studio system, a woman who dared to defy and was punished for it. Others saw her as a tragic cautionary tale about mental illness, addiction, and the dangers of rebellion in a world that demanded compliance. And yet, beneath the myths and sensationalism, there was a deeper truth. Frances Farmer was a fiercely intelligent, outspoken woman living in an era that had little tolerance for such qualities, especially in women. Her battles with authority, her defiance of studio control, and her refusal to conform were not signs of madness but of strength. She challenged Hollywood long before it was fashionable to do so, and in doing so, she paid the ultimate price. Today, Frances Farmer's story resonates as both a tragedy and an inspiration. She remains a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power, whether in Hollywood studios or psychiatric institutions. At the same time, she has been reclaimed as an icon of resistance, a woman who refused to be silenced even as the world branded her mad. In the end, Frances Farmer's legacy is not defined solely by her scandals, her arrests, or the myths of lobotomy. It is defined by her courage to remain herself in a world determined to break her. She was brilliant, flawed, rebellious, and unforgettable, and though Hollywood may have tried to erase her, Frances Farmer endures, not as a forgotten casualty, but as one of the most haunting legends of its golden age.